You can scroll through your phone for 3 hours without even noticing, but you can't sit down to study for 15 minutes, even when you know that 15 minutes could change your life. That is not laziness. That is not weakness. That is not a character flaw you need to fix before you're allowed to live the life you want. That is your brain doing exactly what it was designed to do. And there's a specific mechanism inside your nervous system that makes hard things feel impossible, and easy things feel necessary. Most people spend their entire lives fighting that mechanism with willpower. Willpower loses every single time. Not because they're not trying hard enough, because they're using the wrong tool. This video is about understanding the right tool. Once you see how this mechanism actually works, not the motivational version, the neurological version, the cycle of knowing what to do and still not doing it begins to make a different kind of sense. And things that make sense are always easier to change than things that feel random, broken, and deeply personal. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you is going to reframe every moment you've ever hated yourself for not following through. Before we get into the mechanism, here is something worth establishing. This problem is not rare. This is not something that happens to a specific type of person. The experience of knowing exactly what you need to do and being completely unable to make yourself do it is one of the most universal experiences in modern human psychology. In my years working with people on behavior change, the sentence I have heard more than any other is this: I know what I need to do. I just can't make myself do it. Teachers, executives, athletes, parents, high achievers by any external measure, all of them stuck in the same gap. Between intention and action. Between knowing and doing. Between the person they want to be and the person who keeps reaching for the phone. That gap is not a moral failure. It is a wiring problem. And wiring can be changed. Here is how it actually works. Your brain has one primary objective, not your happiness, not your health, not your goals, or your relationships, or your sense of meaning. Survival. Everything your brain does, every system it runs, every alarm it sounds, every preference it builds, is organized around keeping you alive. And the central tool it uses to accomplish this is a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Most people think dopamine is the pleasure chemical. It is not. Dopamine is not about pleasure. Dopamine is about wanting, about motivation, about the drive to go towards something. When your brain releases dopamine, you don't feel happy. You feel compelled. You feel the pull towards something. You feel the wanting. And this is where the modern problem begins. Your brain releases dopamine in response to things it has learned to associate with reward. Early in human history, those things were food, safety, social connection, reproduction, things that genuinely helped the organism survive. Today, engineers at some of the most sophisticated technology companies in the world have spent billions of dollars designing systems that hijack this exact mechanism. The infinite scroll, the unpredictable like, the notification that arrives at the precise moment your attention might otherwise drift towards something difficult. These are not accidents. They are dopamine delivery systems, engineered to activate your brain's reward circuitry with a precision that evolution never had to compete with. So your brain has been trained by years of easy dopamine. And what a brain trained on easy dopamine does when you ask it to study, to exercise, to do the hard thing, is feel resistance, not laziness. Neurological resistance. The same system that compels you toward the phone refuses to activate for the thing that requires effort because it has learned that the phone delivers the reward faster. A research study from the University of Chicago, published in the Journal of Consumer Psychology in 2011 by Lauren Nordgren and Eileen Cho, found that people consistently underestimate the power of their own impulses when they are removed from the triggering environment, and dramatically overestimate their ability to resist when exposed to it. The researchers called this empathy gap. We plan our behavior in a state of calm, assuming we'll have the same resources available in the moment of temptation. We won't. The environment changes the neurology. This means willpower isn't just limited. It is structurally inadequate as a strategy for competing against engineered dopamine delivery. You are not failing because you're weak. You are failing because you're using a hand tool against a machine. Now here is the part that changes everything. Your brain is not fixed. The wiring that currently runs toward your phone, toward avoidance, toward the path of least resistance, that wiring was built through repetition. And repetition works in both directions. The same mechanism that created the problem is the mechanism you use to solve it. Neuroscience calls this neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to physically reorganize itself based on repeated experience. Every time you repeat a behavior, you strengthen the neural pathway associated with it. Every time you repeat a different behavior, you begin building a new one. In 1949, Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb articulated what has since become one of the most replicated principles in neuroscience. Neurons that fire together wire together. The more consistently two neurons activate in sequence, the stronger and more automatic that connection becomes. This means your current patterns are not destiny. They are just the result of what you've been repeating. But I need to be honest with you about what this means in practice, because most content about neuroplasticity stops before the part that matters most. Building a new neural pathway is not comfortable. It is not fast. And in the beginning, it feels exactly like failure, because you're doing the hard thing without the reward signal that would make it feel worthwhile. The dopamine hasn't arrived yet. The new pathway hasn't been reinforced enough to feel natural. The brain is still pulling toward the old rote. This is the window where people quit. And it's not because they lack commitment. It's because they interpret the discomfort as a sign that something is wrong, when it is actually the sign that something is being built. Let me show you what this looks like in real life. A woman I worked with, I'll call her Sarah, came to see me exhausted and ashamed. She was a teacher, 2 children, fully aware of everything she needed to do. Exercise, study for the certification she'd been putting off for 3 years, stop spending hours on her phone every evening. She knew all of it. She'd planned all of it. She'd failed at all of it so many times that the failure itself had become part of her identity. She said, "I know what I need to do. I just can't make myself do it." I asked her one question. "When you think about exercising, what do you feel in your body?" She said, "Dread, exhaustion, like I've already failed before I've started." Then I asked, "When you pick up your phone, what do you feel?" She thought about it. She said, "Relief, like I've earned a break." That answer explains everything. Her brain had built precise associations over years. Exercise equals discomfort, effort, potential failure. Phone equals relief, reward, safety. Those associations weren't opinions, they were neural architecture. And as long as that architecture remained unchanged, no amount of motivation, intention, or self-judgment was going to override it. The biology would win every time. What I told her next, she didn't expect. I said, "I don't want you to start exercising. I want you to drive to the gym, put on your shoes, and drive home. That's it. And when you get home, I want you to celebrate like you just finished a marathon." She laughed. She thought I was joking. She tried it. On the first day, she drove to the gym, put on her shoes, sat in the car for 2 minutes, and drove home. She texted her daughter, "I went to the gym today." Her daughter responded with pride. She felt something she hadn't expected. A small, real sense of accomplishment. Second day, same thing. Third day, she was already in her shoes and she thought, "I'm here." Maybe 5 minutes on the treadmill. 6 weeks later, she was going 4 times a week. What changed wasn't her willpower. What changed was the association. Her brain began to connect the gym, not with dread, but with the small, repeated experience of completion, of showing up and surviving, of the dopamine released by a genuine, if tiny, victory. The desire to go came after the behavior, not before. This is the most important thing I can tell you about motivation. You are waiting for motivation to arrive before you act. The science says you have the sequence exactly backwards. Motivation follows action. It does not precede it. But here is the challenge nobody warns you about. Before the motivation arrives, before the new pathway is strong enough to generate its own reward signal, there is a period of pure discomfort, a period where you do the thing without wanting to, without feeling good about it, without any internal sense that it's working. In behavioral neuroscience, researchers at Stanford have documented what they call the habituation curve, the period between the initiation of a new behavior and the point where the brain begins to generate anticipatory dopamine for that behavior. The length of this curve varies, but the consistent finding is this: the curve exists. There is always a period of unrewarded repetition before the new behavior starts to feel natural. Most people quit during this window. They interpret the absence of reward as evidence that the behavior isn't working or that they're not capable of sustaining it. They're actually at the point of maximum investment, and they leave before the return arrives. This is what you need to understand about the discomfort you feel when you try to do hard things. The resistance is not a sign that you should stop. The resistance is the sound of new neural architecture being built. Now I want to address something that runs underneath all of this. Something that most content about productivity and behavior change never touches because it's uncomfortable to say directly. Dopamine is not about pleasure, but there's a deeper distinction that matters even more. Wanting is not the same as liking. This insight comes from the work of neuroscientist Kent Berridge at the University of Michigan, whose research separated the brain's wanting system, driven by dopamine, from the brain's liking system, driven by opioid receptors. These are not the same system. They can operate independently, and in modern life, they frequently do. The person who can't stop checking their phone often doesn't enjoy it. Ask them, honestly, after 30 minutes of scrolling, did that feel good? Most will say no. They feel worse. They feel drained, slightly hollow, vaguely ashamed. They didn't like it, but they wanted it. The dopamine drove the wanting. The opioid system registered no meaningful pleasure. This is the trap of easy dopamine. It activates the wanting without delivering the liking. The hard things work in the opposite direction. Exercise, deep work, genuine learning, difficult conversations that needed to happen. These often feel uncomfortable or even unpleasant during, but after, the liking system activates. Endorphins, a genuine sense of competence, the specific satisfaction of having done something that mattered. So when you're in the middle of the hard thing and it feels bad, that is not a signal that it's the wrong thing. That is the wanting system finding no shortcut and the liking system not yet activated. Both of those states are temporary, and they end at the exact moment the wanting system gives up, looking for an easier route, and the liking system registers what was actually built. There is one more thing about the neurochemistry worth understanding before we talk about what to do, because it directly affects how you interpret the signals your own body sends you when you try to do hard things. Most people believe they need to feel calm, comfortable and ready before they can perform at their best. The neuroscience says something more complicated and more useful. The stress response, the elevated heart rate, the heightened alertness, the mild anxiety before something difficult, is not a sign that something is wrong. It is the autonomic nervous system preparing the organism for a demanding task. Adrenaline is released. Cortisol rises. Blood flow is redirected. Cognitive focus sharpens. In a 2012 study by Alison Wood Brooks at Harvard Business School, participants were told either to try to calm down before a performance task or to reinterpret their anxiety as excitement. The group that reinterpreted the anxiety, that said to themselves, "I am excited," rather than "I need to calm down," consistently outperformed the group trying to suppress the arousal. Not by a small margin, significantly. The physiological states are nearly identical. The interpretation is different, and the interpretation changes the performance. This means that the nervous feeling before you sit down to do the hard thing, before you walk into the difficult conversation, before you start the project you've been avoiding, that is not a warning sign. That is activation. That is your nervous system allocating resources toward what you're about to do. The question is not how to make it go away. The question is how to work with it, reinterpret it, not as fear, as the physical preparation for something that matters. Athletes do this. Performers do this. The most consistent high performers in any domain have learned, explicitly or intuitively, to read their own arousal not as a threat, but as signal. The signal that the body knows this is important and is preparing accordingly. You have access to the same signal. What changes is what you make it mean. Now let's talk about what practically separates the people who rewire successfully from the people who don't. Because it is not effort. It is not commitment. It is not even consistency in the way most people understand it. It is the size of the starting ask. The brain's primary response to change is threat detection. Radical change activates a threat response. The brain reads large deviation from established pattern as potential danger and mobilizes resistance. This is why the person who decides to overhaul their entire life on January 1st and fails by January 15th is not lacking discipline. They triggered their own nervous system's defense mechanisms. The researcher, James Clear, building on B.J. Fogg's work at Stanford's Behavior Design Lab, documented what happens when the starting behavior is made ridiculously small, smaller than anyone would reasonably expect to matter. 1 minute of exercise, 1 page of reading, 2 minutes of the thing. What they found was that the starting size mattered far more than the intended size. A commitment small enough to feel like nothing is a commitment the brain does not resist. And a commitment the brain does not resist gets completed. And a completion strengthens the pathway. And a strengthened pathway makes the next repetition slightly easier. This is not a trick. It is the precise mechanism by which neural architecture is built. The brain learns through repetition, not through intensity. A daily repetition of 1 minute builds faster than a weekly repetition of 1 hour. Not because of the time, because of the frequency of the signal. The signal is, this behavior is part of who I am. And that brings us to the most important concept in this entire video. The one that most content about behavior change gestures toward without landing on directly. The reason behavior change fails is not effort, it is identity. Your actions do not emerge from your goals. They emerge from your self-concept, from the story you carry about who you are. If you believe, at the level of your operating identity, that you are someone who doesn't exercise, then exercise is not something you do. It is something you attempt, fail at, and eventually abandon, because abandonment confirms the identity you already held. Every sustained behavior change I've witnessed follows the same arc. And it is not the arc most people expect. It does not begin with a goal. It begins with a question. What kind of person do I want to be? And then a smaller question. What would that person do today? Not eventually. Not after the motivation arrives. Not once the circumstances are right. Today, the person who exercises is not someone who feels like exercising. The person who exercises is someone who has decided that they are the kind of person who exercises, and then acts from that identity, even when it feels wrong, even when it's uncomfortable, even when every neural pathway they have is pulling in the opposite direction. The technical term for this in behavioral psychology is identity-based behavior. The philosopher's version is simpler. You become what you repeatedly do. I also want to address something that consistently derails people at the exact moment they need to stay on course. and that most content about behavior change actively avoids saying because it challenges the comfortable narrative around motivation and readiness. You're going to have days where you do not want to do the thing, not mildly reluctant, genuinely, viscerally opposed to it. Days where the resistance is so strong that continuing feels absurd, like forcing something that every signal in your body is telling you to stop. These days are not a sign that the approach isn't working. These are the days that determine whether the approach works. The moment of maximum resistance is the moment of maximum importance. This is not a motivational abstraction. It is a description of how neural pathway competition works. The old pattern is most active when the new pattern is closest to displacing it. The brain allocates the most resistance to the behaviors that most threaten the established architecture. This means the day you feel most like stopping is often the day you are closest to the threshold where the behavior becomes automatic. Most people quit on that day. They interpret the resistance as truth, as an accurate read of their own capacity, their own readiness, their own compatibility with the behavior. They don't recognize it as the final organized effort of the competing pathway before it starts to lose dominance. I want to suggest a different interpretation. When the resistance is at its highest, ask not whether you should stop. Ask what's happening at the neurological level. The answer is almost always the same. You are at a threshold. The old pathway is fighting. And the most important thing you can do at a threshold is not the thing that feels easiest. It is the thing you committed to. Even imperfectly, even briefly, even badly. Because the brain does not grade quality, it registers completion. And completion, at the moment of maximum resistance, is the most powerful signal you can send to the system you are trying to build. Now let me be very precise about something that most behavior change content gets wrong, before I tell you the most important story in this entire video. When researchers talk about identity-based behavior change, they are not talking about affirmations. They are not talking about visualizing yourself as a different person. They are not talking about pretending to be someone you're not. They are talking about a specific process by which the brain updates its model of who you are based on behavioral evidence. Your brain maintains a working model of your identity, not consciously, but functionally. It predicts your future behavior based on your past behavior. When you act consistently with that model, the model is confirmed and the behavior becomes easier. When you act inconsistently with that model, the brain experiences cognitive dissonance, a state of discomfort from the mismatch between the self-concept and the action. Most people experience this dissonance in one direction. They want to change, they try to act differently, and the dissonance makes the new behavior feel unnatural, forced, like performance. The dissonance is real, but it is temporary, because the brain resolves dissonance not by abandoning the new behavior, but by updating the self-concept. If you go to the gym when you don't feel like a gym person, the dissonance is uncomfortable. If you go again, and again, and again, at some point, the brain updates. Not consciously, not through a moment of insight. The model simply reflects the evidence. The evidence says, this is what you do. And gradually, without announcement, you become someone who goes to the gym. The votes accumulate, the model updates, the identity shifts. This is why James Clear writes that every action is a vote for the type of person you want to become. Not because it's a poetic metaphor, because it is a literal description of how the brain builds its self-model. And this is why the size of each action matters so much less than its consistency. A 2-minute action that happens every day sends a clearer identity signal than a 1-hour action that happens once a week. The brain is tracking frequency. It is asking, what does this organism do reliably? And the answer to that question becomes who you are. There is one more obstacle that runs between where you are and the behavior change you want. And it operates below the level of strategy. It operates at the level of belief. Most people who struggle with hard things carry a set of conclusions about themselves that they have never explicitly decided to hold. They are not beliefs in the sense of consciously adopted positions. They are conclusions drawn from repeated experience, accepted as fact, and never re-examined. I don't have discipline. I am not a morning person. I don't have the kind of brain that can focus for long periods. I've always been this way. Some people can change. I'm not one of them. These conclusions feel like accurate descriptions of reality. They are not. They are predictions disguised as descriptions. And the difference matters enormously, because a description of a fixed state requires acceptance, while a prediction of future behavior can be tested. Research on what Carol Dweck at Stanford calls a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset found that the belief about whether a trait is fixed or changeable directly affects whether effort is applied. People who believe intelligence, discipline, and self-control are fixed traits experience failure as confirmation of those traits' limits. People who believe those same qualities are the result of applied effort experience failure as information about what approach to adjust. The belief determines the response to failure, and the response to failure determines whether change accumulates. Here is what I can tell you about the belief that you cannot change. There is no neurological basis for it. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize itself, operates throughout the human lifespan. The rate slows with age. The capacity does not disappear. Adults change, not as easily as children, not as quickly as they want to, but genuinely, measurably, permanently. The question is not whether you can rewire. The question is whether you're willing to endure the discomfort of the period between beginning the rewiring and the point where it begins to feel natural. And underneath that question is this one. Do you believe the discomfort is temporary? Because if you believe the discomfort is evidence of a permanent incompatibility, if the resistance feels like proof that you are not the kind of person who can do this, then you will interpret every hard moment as confirmation of the belief and stop. If you believe the discomfort is the process, if the resistance feels like exactly what it is, which is the signal that new architecture is being built, then you will stay. The difference between these two interpretations is not minor. It is the entire distance between the person you are and the person you intend to be. Before I tell you the most important story in this entire video, I want to give you one more concrete illustration of how the wanting system actually redirects, because it explains something that most people find deeply confusing about their own behavior. Have you ever pursued something intensely, achieved it, and felt not satisfied, but empty? Or found yourself returning again and again to something that never satisfies, but also never stops pulling? This is not a philosophical problem. It is a description of two separate neurological systems in conflict. A person I worked with, I'll call him David, late 30s, high-achieving professionally, came because he could not understand why he felt nothing when he accomplished things. He had built a successful career, reached the milestones he'd set for himself years earlier, and felt, as he described it, fine, not good, fine. Meanwhile, he spent 3 to 4 hours every evening on his phone, not enjoying it, knowing he wasn't enjoying it, unable to stop. When I asked him what he genuinely wanted in his daily life, not what his goals were, but what he actually felt in the body wanted, he couldn't answer. He knew what he was supposed to want. His entire life had been organized around it. But the actual felt sense of want had been so consistently redirected toward easy dopamine that it had stopped functioning reliably as a guide to what would satisfy him. This is what Berridge's research makes precise. The wanting system can be hijacked, redirected toward objects that do not deliver the satisfaction they promise. And once redirected, it does not self-correct easily. It keeps wanting the same objects even as the liking system registers no real pleasure. The practical implication. If you want to feel motivated toward things that actually matter, you need to do two things simultaneously. Reduce the easy dopamine inputs that are misdirecting the wanting system, and expose the wanting system to repeated small experiences of genuine satisfaction from hard behaviors. The first creates the space. The second provides the new target. What David did was simple and initially uncomfortable. He set a limit on his phone after work, not because he had anything against it philosophically, but because he recognized that the wanting system needed time without its current target before it would redirect. And every evening for 30 minutes, phone away, he worked on a project he'd been postponing for years. Not because he felt motivated, because he showed up anyway. For 2 weeks, it felt like nothing. Then, something shifted. He started thinking about the project during the day, looking forward to the evening session. The want had transferred towards something that, when engaged, also activated the liking system. This is the sequence. Not wait to want, then act, but act, then want. Now let me tell you the most important story in this entire video, and how the wrong reason fails, even when someone tries for decades. A patient of mine, I'll call her Maria, had smoked for 40 years. She had tried to quit more times than she could count. Patches, gum, medications, willpower, shame, health scares. Nothing held. She came to me convinced she was simply one of the people who couldn't quit. That some people can, and some people can't, and she had made her peace with being in the second group. Then her son called her and told her she was going to be a grandmother. He also told her that he didn't want his child exposed to cigarette smoke, and that if she wanted to be present in his family's life, really present, regularly present, she needed to stop. She called me 3 weeks after that conversation. She had not smoked a single cigarette. After 40 years, 3 weeks. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it contains the most important truth in this entire video. She had not gained new information about the health consequences of smoking. She already knew them. She had not discovered a new technique or a better medication. She was using the same brain chemistry she had always had. What changed was the why. For 40 years, she had been trying to stop smoking for herself, for her health, for her appearance, for her energy. All legitimate reasons. None of them strong enough. The moment the reason became about someone she loved, someone who needed her in a specific, concrete way, the equation changed completely. The discomfort of quitting became smaller than the cost of not quitting. The want system reorganized around something larger than the habit. Not trying is the greatest failure. I want to say that slowly, because it is the most misunderstood idea in this entire video, and it is the one that people most need to hear. Most people who struggle with hard things are not failing because they tried and fell short. They are failing because they calculated the risk of trying against the pain of potential failure, and decided that not trying was safer. At least, if you don't try, you can maintain the story that you might have succeeded. If you try and fail, that story is gone. But not trying is not a neutral state. Not trying is a choice. And that choice has consequences that compound over time in the same way that trying does. Every day you don't try, you are strengthening the neural pathway that says, this is not something you do. You are writing the identity story by default rather than by intention. You are not protecting yourself from failure. You are choosing it in advance, quietly, without the acknowledgement that it even is a choice. The gap between the person you intend to be and the person you are. That gap does not close through intention. It closes through the daily, repetitive, uncomfortable act of behaving like the person you intend to be before you feel like that person. Before the evidence supports it. Before the motivation arrives. You are not waiting to become ready. You are building readiness through the act of beginning. Now I want to address the environment. Because behavior change does not happen in a vacuum, and the physical context you operate in either supports or undermines the new neural pathways you're trying to build. Neuroscientist Wendy Wood at USC has spent decades studying the role of context in habit formation. Her research, summarized in her 2019 book, Good Habits, Bad Habits, found that approximately 43% of daily behaviors are performed automatically in response to environmental cues rather than conscious decision. Nearly half of what you do every day is not decided. It is triggered. This means your environment is already making decisions for you. The phone on the nightstand makes the decision to check it first thing in the morning before your conscious intentions have a chance to intervene. The unhealthy food at eye level in the refrigerator makes the decision about what you eat when you're stressed. The gym bag buried in the closet makes the decision about whether you exercise. Designing your environment is not a productivity hack. It is the structural recognition that behavior follows context, and that context can be intentionally arranged. The book visible on the desk gets read. The phone in the other room gets checked less. The gym clothes laid out the night before get put on. Not because of willpower, because the environmental cue fires before the resistance does. Every time you deliberately arrange your environment to make the right behavior easier and the wrong behavior harder, you are doing something neurologically significant. You are reducing the cognitive load required to initiate the desired behavior. And reduced initiation cost is the single most reliable predictor of whether a behavior gets repeated. Before we get to that, there's a specific failure pattern worth naming explicitly because it's the most common reason people quit just before the behavior becomes self-sustaining. The pattern is this: inconsistency disguised as high effort. Most people, when they decide to change a behavior, do not fail because they tried too little. They fail because they tried too much, too inconsistently. The person who commits to working out for an hour every day of the week succeeds for 3 days, fails on day 4, declares the attempt a failure, and waits until Monday to start again. That person is generating the experience of failure at a rate that far exceeds their capacity to absorb it. The brain does not register missed days as neutral. Every missed repetition strengthens the old pathway relative to the new one. The missed day does not simply erase a day of progress. It actively contributes to the competing pattern, which is why recovery from a missed day is not about making up the missed work. It is about returning to the behavior as quickly as possible to prevent the competing pathway from regaining dominance. The research on habit formation, notably James Clear's analysis of existing behavioral studies in atomic habits, consistently shows that the critical failure point is not the first missed day. It is the decision made on the day after the first missed day. The person who returns to the behavior the following day recovers the progress quickly. The person who waits for a psychologically clean restart point, the beginning of the week, the beginning of the month, often finds that the restart never fully happens because each delay makes the resume feel larger and more daunting. The rule is simple: never miss twice. 1 missed day is a deviation. 2 missed days is the beginning of a new pattern, and new patterns, in either direction, build quickly once initiated. There's one more structural factor that significantly affects whether behavior change succeeds or fails, and it is the one most people are least willing to ask for. Accountability. Not the passive accountability of telling someone your goals. Active accountability. A specific person or structure that expects a report, asks direct questions, and does not accept vague reassurances. Research from the American Society of Training and Development found that people who commit to a specific accountability appointment have a 95% success rate in completing the behavior, compared to 65% for those who just write the goal down, and lower still for those who only set an intention. The difference is not motivational, it is structural. When someone is expecting a report, The cost of not completing the behavior becomes immediate and social rather than abstract and future. The accountability person needs to be someone who will ask hard questions without accepting soft answers. Not someone who will comfort you when you failed. Someone who will ask directly, "Did you do it?" and expect the answer to be yes. This is not weakness. This is using the brain's social circuitry in service of your goals rather than against them. There is one more thing the brain needs from you to sustain behavior change over time. And it is the thing that people are most embarrassed to provide themselves because it seems childish, because it seems like it shouldn't be necessary, because they feel they shouldn't need it. Acknowledgement, not external praise, not other people's validation. The internal, conscious, deliberate recognition of your own progress. When you complete a difficult task, even a small one, and you explicitly acknowledge that completion, you trigger a dopamine release. Not a large one, but a real one. And that dopamine begins the work of associating the difficult behavior with reward. With each repetition, the anticipatory signal strengthens. The behavior that once required all your willpower to initiate begins to generate its own motivation. This is not positive thinking. This is operant conditioning applied to your own nervous system. The brain reinforces behaviors that are followed by reward. You are providing the reward. And the reward is real, neurologically real, regardless of whether the achievement that triggered it feels significant. The athlete who has qualified for the Olympics and the person who went for a 5-minute walk this morning are both doing something the brain responds to in the same basic way. They completed the behavior they committed to. The scale is different. The neurological mechanism is identical. Celebrate the small completions, not because they deserve celebration by any external standard, because your brain needs the signal that the hard thing was worth doing, and you are the only one who can provide it. Now I want to bring everything together around the deepest question this subject raises. You can understand all of this. The dopamine mechanism, the neuroplasticity, the identity-based approach, the environmental design, the small starting ask, the acknowledgement loop. You can understand it completely and still not change. Because understanding is not the bottleneck. The bottleneck is the moment of decision. The specific, private, unglamorous moment when the phone is in your hand and the book is on the table, and every neural pathway you have points toward the phone, and you have to decide what you do next. That moment happens dozens of times every day, and each time it happens, you are not just choosing what to do in the next 5 minutes. You are casting a vote for who you are. The researcher and author Brené Brown has written about this in the context of courage, but it applies directly here. Every choice to do the difficult thing in the face of the easier option is an act of integrity, of alignment between what you say you value and what you actually do. And that alignment, accumulated over time, is the only reliable foundation for the kind of confidence most people are desperately trying to feel before they act. You do not build confidence and then do the hard thing. You do the hard thing and then build the confidence. There is also a specific kind of resistance that most people encounter somewhere around week 2 or 3 of any new behavior. And it is not what they expect. It is not laziness. It is the brain's own self-protective mechanism creating stories. I'm tired. This isn't the right time. I'll do twice as much tomorrow. I deserve a break. The circumstances aren't ideal. These are not thoughts. These are the neurological equivalent of your brain's immune system responding to a perceived threat. The threat is change itself. The brain interprets the deviation from established pattern as a risk and mobilizes its full narrative capability to return you to the familiar state. The response is not to argue with the stories. It is to recognize them as a category when you notice yourself constructing a reason not to do the thing you committed to. That is not legitimate information about whether today is a good day to do the thing. That is the resistance. And the resistance is most active at the exact moment you are closest to a threshold. Resistance intensifies just before a pattern begins to shift. If you understand this, the appearance of a convincing reason to stop becomes, paradoxically, a signal to continue. The hardest days to maintain the behavior are the days that most need the behavior to be maintained. Let me be specific about what this looks like in practice, because general principles without concrete implementation are just information. Choose one behavior, not three, not the full transformation. 1. Make it small enough that you cannot convince yourself it's too hard. Not aspirationally small, absurdly small. If you want to exercise, the first commitment is not 20 minutes, it is 2 minutes. If you want to write, it is 2 sentences. If you want to study, it is 1 page. Do it at the same time, in the same context, every day. The consistency of context is more important than the duration of the behavior. Your brain associates the cue with the behavior. Once the cue is strong enough, it begins to generate the wanting before you consciously decide to begin. Track it visibly, not in an app you rarely open. On paper, on a calendar, somewhere you see every day. Put an X on each day you complete it. The visual representation of an unbroken chain creates its own motivational pull. The brain's pattern recognition system activates a reluctance to break sequences it can see. Acknowledge each completion, explicitly, out loud if possible. Your brain needs the signal. Give it the signal. When you miss a day, and you will miss a day, the rule is never miss twice. 1 missed day is an accident. 2 missed days begins a new pattern. Return to the behavior the next day regardless of how far off track you feel. The pathway is never completely erased. It rebuilds faster than it was built the first time. Add complexity only after the behavior is automatic, not before. The brain can sustain approximately 1 major behavioral change at a time. After the first behavior runs without significant resistance, when you find yourself doing it without the internal negotiation, you can add a second, not simultaneously, sequentially. And finally, because this is the part that makes everything else sustainable or not, you need a reason that is larger than the behavior. Not a goal, a why. Goals are outcomes. They live in the future, and they disappear when they're achieved. A reason that is larger than the behavior is something different. It is the connection between the daily repetition and something that matters in a way that transcends any single result. Maria didn't stop smoking because she finally found the right nicotine replacement strategy. She stopped because her granddaughter needed her to be present, and being present required being alive, and being alive required stopping. The discomfort of quitting became structurally smaller than the cost of the alternative. When your why is genuinely larger than your discomfort, the calculation changes. The hard thing stops feeling like sacrifice. It begins to feel like the obvious choice. Not every day, not without resistance, but consistently enough that the pathway strengthens. And as the pathway strengthens, the resistance weakens. And as the resistance weakens, the behavior that once required everything begins to feel gradually like the thing you do, like who you are. That is not the end of the work. There is no end of the work. But it is the beginning of a different relationship with the hard things. One where they are no longer obstacles you have to fight through to get to the life you want. They become the life you want. The gap between who you intend to be and who you are does not close through understanding. It closes through action. Through the repeated, accumulating daily act of behaving like the person you intend to be. Before you feel ready, before the motivation arrives, before the evidence supports it. You already know what to do. The only question is what you do next. I want to be specific about that question, because most people interpret it as asking about a large decision, a commitment, a declaration, a turning point. It is not asking about that. It is asking about the next 5 minutes. The next 5 minutes are where every life is actually lived. Not in the intention, not in the goal, not in the vision of who you want to become, but in the specific, small, unglamorous moment where you either do the thing or you don't. And in the next 5 minutes, you have access to everything you need. Not willpower, not extraordinary motivation, not a perfect version of yourself. You have a brain that is plastic, which means it is changeable. You have a dopamine system that responds to reward, which means it can be trained. You have a self-concept that updates based on evidence, which means it can be rewritten by your behavior. You have the capacity to make the starting ask small enough that the resistance cannot reasonably justify inaction. You have a body that is activated and ready, reading the signals of difficult things as preparation rather than threat. And you have, somewhere, a why. Something that is larger than the discomfort of any single difficult moment. Something that, when connected to the behavior clearly enough, makes the calculation obvious. The why for Maria was a granddaughter she had not yet met. Yours is whatever it is. The child who needs you present. The version of yourself you owe it to yourself to become. The project that will not exist unless you make it exist. The relationship that needs you at your best. The health that allows you to be there for the things that matter. Whatever it is, name it clearly. Write it where you will see it on the days where the resistance is highest. Not to motivate yourself with it. To remember what the discomfort is in service of. Because the discomfort is always in service of something. The question is whether you know what that something is, and whether it is worth the discomfort. You already know the answer. What you do next is how you tell your brain. There is something I want to say directly before we finish, because it is the thing most people need to hear most, and it is the thing that content about productivity and behavior change almost universally fails to say. You are not behind. The thought that you are behind, that you should have figured this out sooner, that you have wasted years that cannot be recovered, that other people your age are further along than you because they understood something you didn't, that thought is one of the most effective weapons the resistance has. Because if you are behind, catching up requires extraordinary effort. If catching up requires extraordinary effort, starting feels overwhelming. If starting feels overwhelming, not starting feels rational, and not starting confirms the belief that you are behind. The loop runs itself. Here is the counter-truth. The only place behavior change can begin is where you are right now. Not where you could have been. Not where you would be if you'd started earlier. Where you are. And where you are is not behind. Where you are is the only possible starting point. Every day you do the thing, even badly, even briefly, even in the face of resistance that tells you it's pointless, is a day where the brain receives the signal. Every day the signal arrives, the pathway strengthens fractionally. Every day the pathway strengthens, the next day's initiation is fractionally easier. This is the compound effect of behavioral repetition. It does not feel significant in the moment. It feels like almost nothing. Until the day it doesn't. Until the day you realize that the thing you used to have to force yourself to do has become something you simply do. That day does not announce itself in advance. It arrives quietly, in the middle of an ordinary week, in the form of the habit running without the internal negotiation you have grown so accustomed to. And on that day, you will understand that the discomfort of every repetition that preceded it was not wasted. It was the investment. You already know what to do. The question is not whether you're capable. The question is what you do in the next 5 minutes. Begin there.